So Mr. Jones headed to the sacrament of reconciliation, confession. He went to make a confession. And he got into the confessional and sat there with the good father and said, "Father, I have sinned." He says, "I have stolen some lumber." And stole it from his neighbor. And so anyways, the priest said, "Well, how much lumber did you steal?" And he says, "Well, I built a birdhouse." He said, "Okay, all right, well, don't do any more of this." But he said, "Why don't you go say one Our Father and one Hail Mary?" So he went off and did his penance and came back the next week. And says, "Father, I have sinned." He says, "I have stolen some lumber." Okay, and the priest kind of looked and said, "Well, okay, how much lumber did you steal?" And he said, "I built a shed." He says, "Wow, this is taking a little bit more lumber than I thought here, And so anyways, he says, "Go home," and he says, "I want you to say 3 Our Fathers and 3 Hail Marys." It's getting a little bit more serious. So he goes home and does his penance, and of course he shows up the next week. He says, "Father, I've sinned." He says, "I've stolen some lumber." And of course, the priest was like, "Well, my goodness, what more have you done?" He says, "Well, how much lumber did you steal?" He says, "Well, I built a garage." And he says, "Boy, this is really getting serious." He says, "I want you to go home and I want you to pray a rosary, for your penance." And he says, "That's fine, I can do that." So he goes home, but shows up the next week and says, "Father, I've sinned. I've stolen some lumber." And the priest is just, again, alarmed. And he says, "Well, this is getting a little out of hand. How much lumber did you steal?" He says, "Well, that garage?" He says, "I built a house onto that garage." And the priest is just saying, "This is not good. This is not good. I mean, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the 3 Our Fathers, the 3 Hail Marys. I know I've given you a rosary." And so he looks at the man and he says, "Do you know how to make a novena?" And of course, the man says, "Father, if you have the plans, I've got the lumber." I really don't know what that has to do with today's readings, but I just thought it was a good way to lead into this. So now, I think as I kind of reflected this week, and especially the first reading and the gospel coming together, the prophet Malachi, and of course, Jesus, he's kind of challenging us a little bit with, kind of the way that we lead our lives outside of this room here. How we lead our lives away from what, our faith, the practice of our faith. And he's kind of challenging us to look at our lives and saying, are we hypocritical? Are we hypocritical? Do we come here and put on that wonderful hat that says, I'm a good Catholic, and then you leave that hat at the door? He wants us to really reflect and think, do we carry it beyond this? Because that's really the challenge. I mean, he kind of uses the example in the gospel, Jesus does, of talking about the scribes and the Pharisees who, were very important people in that church in Judaism. I mean, the scribes were sort of like lawyers. They were sort of like attorneys, all right? I mean, they took the law and, they kind of looked at it and said, okay, this is how it should be interpreted. This is what you did. This should be, how it goes. And then the Pharisees, of course, are the ones that were teaching that. They were making sure people understood the law and made sure that people lived the law. But what Jesus is pointing out is he says, they like to do that, but then they don't continue on with it. And they don't make it a part of their lives. And in fact, they began to enjoy, kind of the accolades that come along with being that person in society that's a little bit above everybody else. And they took advantage of, having that great seat in the church or, having, all the accolades when they went to a party or something like that and the greetings in the marketplace. And I can tell you, it happens. I mean, I know Father Dave would probably say the same thing. Sometimes when you go in, to a gathering, sometimes people do treat you just a little bit different, or they start to act a little bit different because they think they're in the presence of holiness. But how do we respond to that is something else. And I think that's important that we walk away today thinking to ourselves, do we take that holier than thou attitude out there, or are we out there trying to live our lives as the good Christians that we're supposed to by not being hypocritical. You know, you hear me say this all the time, you know, with confirmation kids, and I try to drive this message home with them. You know, when you're getting confirmed and you're choosing to be, you know, a Catholic Christian, you're choosing, you know, to live your life as a Catholic Christian, not just choosing that something that you're going to do 1 hour a week on Sundays. You know, this is the easy part. But going out there and taking that Christian life with you, you know, that can be sometimes challenging because then we're out amongst, you know, our family, our friends, the workplace. And we sometimes, I think, forget that we're called to be Christians all the time. You know? And you know, it's interesting that, you know, sometimes when, you know, I'll be in those gatherings and people will say they know that I'm a deacon or something and they know that I'm connected with the church. You know, sometimes that's sort of a little bit of a magnet, and people will come, you know, and they'll share that woe of the church, or they'll share that concern of the church, or their, you know, why they might have fallen away from the church. You know what's interesting? A lot of times when I talk to those people that come up to me that have fallen away, and they'll say, you know, Ron, you know, I kind of got turned off by the church because of the people that claim to be Christian and then how they treated me, you know, or that church leader and how they treated me. And it tells you something that, you know, sometimes us as Christians, we leave it at the door. You know, we shouldn't be those people that are judgmental. We shouldn't be those people that treat people, you know, in a negative, you know, poor way. Because you know what? That might turn people off of the church. Remember last week I talked about this. I said, you know what? You know, you might be the only gospel that somebody reads today. You know, you are here to proclaim that good news. You are here to not only proclaim it, but to live it and to share it with other people. I mean, that's what Jesus is really trying to get at when he's talking to us about being humble and about serving. You know, not looking to be served, but to serve others. Now, I love that letter to the Thessalonians that Paul writes because, you know, he talks about that community. He talks about how important that community has become to him and how he has such an affection to them. But it's interesting, you know, Paul can be considered probably one of the greatest apostles, one of the greatest evangelists because of the number of people that he converted, the number of churches that he founded. I mean, he was just going crazy in that first century, you know, and spreading that good news. But listen to this line that he says. He says, with such affection for you, we were determined to share with you not only the gospel, but our very selves. Paul wasn't just a great preacher. He wasn't just a great preacher, but he had a love and a compassion, you know, for the people that he surrounded himself with. And I think as we look at this reading and we think about our lives, we say to ourselves, are we just preaching to others? Or are we bringing that love of Christ and that compassion of Christ to others? Jesuit Father Donald Neary, he sums it up when he talks about the life of a Christian, when he talks about the word compassion. He says, that is at the heart of what it means to live your life as a disciple. He says, compassion is or is not at the center of our belief. If we are people of compassion, we are close to God. The less compassion we have, the further we stray from each other and God himself. Compassion equals good news. Compassion equals what it means to be a Christian. The word comes from the Latin compassio, and it means, you know, if I were to say to you, what does compassion mean? You'd probably say, oh, I don't know, kindness, you know, love, respect. But at the heart of the word compassion, it is to suffer with, to enter into the pain and the challenges of the people that you love, that you're with, the people that you come in contact with every day. Paul understood this compassion. He didn't just throw the word of God at them and then say, this is all I'm going to do. No, he lived with them, he walked with them, he embraced their lives. And that's what converted them. That's what changed them. That love and that compassion. So if we really want to define what it means to be a Christian, we don't just define it in terms of following the Ten Commandments or following all the doctrines of the church. Now, all those are important because they keep us on the path. But if you're not living those with that love and compassion like Jesus challenges us with, then we aren't doing exactly what we're called to do. I know it's not always easy, because it's a lot easier just to throw the rules at people, to throw the doctrines at people. But there has to be some type of love and compassion, because that is at the heart of what the good news is all about. We always have to come back to that, love and compassion. Again, think about what Paul said. I shared the word of God with you. I preached the good news to you. But I also got to know you and love you and walk with you. So today, my brothers and sisters, I think we need to look at our own lives and the people around us. And are we just throwing words at them? Are we just preaching to them? No matter what we do in our life, or are we bringing the love and the compassion of Christ to them? Because that is what it means to be a Christian.